The Galactic Concord had classified it as an easy war. The official term was Operation Pacification, a routine subjugation of a primitive pre-hyperspace species that had resisted diplomatic integration. The humans, despite their fledgling technology and minuscule numbers, had refused to surrender. They were outmatched in every conceivable way, or so the Concord believed. Grand strategist Sci-Fi stood in the war chamber, his 3 crimson eyes narrowing at the holoscreen before him. The battle footage was incomprehensible. It showed a single human survivor on the ruins of what had once been an Earth outpost. The Concord had deployed precision orbital strikes, planetary bombardments, and hunter drones to ensure no resistance remained. The planet was supposed to be cleansed, and yet this human, clad in tattered combat armor, his face smeared with dirt and blood, was still standing, alone. "This must be a recording error," one of the strategists muttered, adjusting the playback. Zivar remained silent, watching. The human carried an outdated projectile weapon, a relic from a lesser age, and yet, despite its primitive design, he wielded it with deadly efficiency. The footage showed him taking out a dozen Concord soldiers with surgical precision, using debris and terrain to his advantage, moving unpredictably, as if he thrived in chaos. More troubling than his tactics was his expression. The human was smiling. A Concord officer turned to Zivar, his voice laced with disbelief. "One soldier, unarmed, outnumbered, and cut off from supply lines. He should be dead. How is he still fighting?" Zivar exhaled slowly, his mandibles clicking. In frustration, "This is not a war we understand," he admitted. Then the human turned toward the drone, recording him. He raised his weapon, as if he could see them watching. His eyes locked onto the camera, and with slow deliberation, he mouthed something. The translation software struggled, but the meaning became clear. "My turn." Then the last human fired back. The war had never been meant to last this long. When the Galactic Concord had first encountered humanity, they were dismissed as an aggressive but fragile species, incapable of withstanding the sheer force of an interstellar empire. Their technology was centuries behind, their numbers insignificant, and their homeworld, Earth, a planetary corpse, its surface turned to glass in the first wave of orbital bombardments, and yet somehow they were still fighting. Grand strategist. Zivar's frustration deepened as he reviewed the latest battlefield reports. Entire Concord regiments had gone silent. Elite hunter squads, sent to eliminate the last known human outposts, had disappeared without a trace. The few survivors reported ambushes, traps, and tactics so unconventional they defied logic. Humans fought like no other species in the known galaxy. Most species, when faced with overwhelming power, surrendered. Even the warrior races of the Orion cluster understood when resistance was futile. But humans? They fought with deliberate insanity. They adapted to whatever battlefield they were placed in. They turned weaknesses into weapons. And now, one of them had turned the remnants of an obliterated outpost into a killing ground. The lone human warrior had been identified as Lieutenant Elias Voss, a former Special Forces operative, presumed dead when Earth fell. Instead, he had endured. Trapped behind enemy lines with no backup, no supplies, and no reason to hope, he had done something the Concord had not expected. He had hunted them. The war chamber was silent as the strategists analyzed the most recent footage. Voss had repurposed alien technology, turning Concord drones into weapons against their own creators. He had set up crude but effective traps using nothing but scavenged parts. He had learned to track their movements, predict their attacks, and disappear before they could retaliate. He had become a ghost. Zivar turned to Commander Sci-Fi, a hardened veteran of planetary campaigns. "You led the last strike team," Zivar said. "What happened?" Zivar's mandibles twitched, his posture rigid with unease. "We landed with 24 of our best hunters. He was alone." And he killed all of them. The strategists whispered among themselves, struggling to comprehend. Sivath continued, his voice low. He doesn't fight like a soldier. He fights like a cornered animal, one that refuses to die, no matter how many times you strike it. He set the terrain against us. He anticipated our movements. It was as if he had already fought this battle 100 times in his mind before we even landed. The room fell into tense silence. Finally, Zivar spoke. "What is his goal?" Sivath hesitated, then answered. "I think he wants us to keep sending more." A chilling realization settled over the war chamber. Lieutenant Elias Voss wasn't just surviving. He was waiting. Lieutenant Elias Voss crouched in the ruins of what had once been a human outpost, his breathing slow and measured. He had no squad, no command, no backup. Just the weapon in his hands, the knowledge in his head, and the sheer, unrelenting will to survive. The Galactic Concord had crushed Earth, believing the war to be over. But they had failed to grasp one thing about humans. Wars didn't end just because one side declared victory. The rain poured in sheets over the shattered remains of the battlefield, steam rising where molten craters still burned. Voss was outnumbered, outgunned, and cut off from any hope of retreat. But he had turned those disadvantages into weapons. He had been watching them, studying them, learning. Concord forces moved in strict, calculated formations, perfect, disciplined, predictable. They relied on superior numbers and technology, expecting lesser species to crumble beneath their advance. That was their weakness. Humans fought dirty. On the Concord command ship, Grand Strategist Zivar observed the latest incursion. Another elite unit had been dispatched, 20 of their finest, each armed with energy weapons capable of melting through reinforced plating. They advanced in a precise triangular formation, their movements synchronized, and then, in the blink of an eye, the lead warrior disappeared. One moment he was stepping forward. The next, he was gone, yanked into the darkness of the ruins. A gurgling, inhuman screech echoed through the comms, static. The formation halted. They scanned their surroundings with infrared optics, seeking an enemy they could not see. Then, a soft click. A blast erupted beneath them. Concord armor was designed to withstand plasma fire, but Voss hadn't used plasma. He had taken an energy core from a downed drone and rigged it with scrap metal, turning it into an explosive flechette bomb. Shrapnel sliced through the formation, catching 2 more soldiers in its blast radius. 17 remaining. Zivar clenched, his mandibles as he listened to their panicked transmissions. "This is Unit 12. We have a hostile..." A single gunshot rang out. The voice cut off mid-sentence. 16 remaining. The footage was shaky, but it showed Voss moving like a ghost, appearing just long enough to take a shot before vanishing into the wreckage. He was using primitive projectile weapons, outdated compared to Concord plasma rifles, but that was the brilliance of it. Their energy shields were calibrated to counter plasma-based attacks. Kinetic rounds passed right through them. The enemy was equipped for the wrong war. Inside the command chamber, silence stretched as the battle unfolded in real time. The Concord had fought countless species, some stronger, some smarter, some even more technologically advanced. But none of them fought like this. One of the younger officers broke the silence. "This isn't a soldier," Zivar exhaled, his voice dark. "No." Voss was something else. The Concord trained their warriors for battle. Voss had been shaped by it. His species had been born into war, refined by centuries of conflict, conditioned to endure. Unlike Concord forces, who fought for conquest and order, humans fought because they refused to be erased. A soldier fights for victory. A human fights when there is nothing left to fight for. The remaining Concord warriors pulled back, attempting to regroup. Their commander barked orders, switching tactics. They would not fall into the same trap twice. That was their second mistake. Voss had expected this. He had been studying them long before they had even realized he existed. As the squad retreated into a narrow corridor of the ruins, thinking they had the advantage, Voss triggered his final trap. The walls detonated. Sci-Fi watched in horror as the battlefield turned against them. Wreckage collapsed, forming a kill box, forcing the remaining warriors into an exposed position. One by one, they fell. The last surviving Concord soldier stumbled, gasping as he leaned against a smoldering wall. His armor was shattered, his rifle spent. He stared ahead in disbelief as a lone figure emerged from the darkness. Voss, bloodied, battered, and relentless. He knelt beside the dying alien, speaking slowly. The Concord's translators worked frantically to process his words. This isn't an easy war. Then for the first time, he did something no Concord soldier would ever expect. He spared the survivor. Voss stood, turned, and vanished into the storm. And just like that, the last human became more than a soldier. He became a legend. The Galactic Concord had never known fear. They had crushed civilizations, reduced worlds to nothing but dust, and rewritten the fate of countless species. They had always been the conquerors, never the conquered. Until now. Grand Strategist Sci-Fi's war chamber was filled with the grim faces of high-ranking officials. The latest battle reports played on the hollow screens, each one more disturbing than the last. It was no longer just Lieutenant Elias Voss. Other humans had emerged. Survivors, resistant cells, ghosts of a species that should have been extinct, and they were winning. The Concord had no choice. A fleet was dispatched to Voss's last known location, a planetary ruin once designated as an outpost, now known among their soldiers as the Red Graveyard. Thousands of troops, armored warships, orbital bombardment platforms, an overwhelming force to end the resistance once and for all. The fleet descended, shields humming, weapons charged. For a moment, there was silence. The ruins stood empty, lifeless. Then came the first explosion. It started as a chain reaction, hidden charges detonating across the landscape, collapsing entire sectors of the battlefield. Voss had turned the ruins into a death trap. Ships exploded mid-air, their engines compromised before they could land. Infantry scattered as sniper fire picked them off from unseen locations. The Concord had sent an army, and yet it felt like they were the ones being hunted. From orbit, Zivar watched in disbelief. Tactically, this battle should have been over within minutes. But every move they made had already been accounted for. "Sir," an officer spoke in a hushed, fearful tone. "The humans, they've been planning this." Zivar gritted his mandibles. "Explain." The officer pulled up heat signatures. Across the battlefield, underground tunnels were lighting up, not just one, but hundreds. The humans hadn't been running. They had been digging in. Entire resistance networks had been building below the surface, creating an underground labyrinth of ambush points, supply caches, and hidden assault tunnels. The Concord's overwhelming. Numbers were being funneled into kill zones. The realization was slow, horrifying. This wasn't just a battle. This was a human trap. In the middle of the chaos, Lieutenant Elias Voss moved like a phantom. His armor was scorched, his rifle down to its last magazine, but he fought with something the Concord could never understand: desperation. Every enemy that fell was one step closer to victory. Every shot fired was a defiance against extinction. Squadron of Concord elites cornered him near a collapsed structure. Plasma bolts scorched the air as they advanced, their numbers overwhelming. Voss exhaled. One shot left. He didn't fire at them. He fired at the ceiling. The structure collapsed, burying half the squad in debris. Voss lunged from the rubble, using the chaos to grab a fallen plasma rifle. He moved without hesitation, firing into the stunned survivors before vanishing into the smoke. He was relentless. The Concord may have had superior numbers, but he had nothing to lose. From above, Ziva saw the war shifting. Their forces were breaking down, retreating, fleeing. A human victory should have been impossible. And yet, as Ziva's screens flickered with the final reports, he saw the truth. The Concord wasn't hunting humans anymore. The humans were hunting them. His officers turned to him, their eyes wide with uncertainty. "Strategist, we need to pull back." Zivar clenched his mandibles. His empire had raised human worlds, believing them easy prey. Now he realized the truth. Humanity wasn't an empire. It was a force of nature, and it would never stop. The battle was over, but the war had just begun. The Galactic Concord's fleet had fled in disgrace, leaving behind the ruins of a battlefield they had once considered theirs. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of scorched metal. Silence settled over the shattered wasteland where the last human had made his stand. Lieutenant Elias Voss stood alone, his armor cracked, his body bruised, but his spirit unbroken. He holstered his scavenged plasma rifle, staring up at the retreating warships. They had run. They had feared him. He exhaled, the adrenaline finally wearing off. His war wasn't over, far from it, but he had won this battle, and now the Concord knew the truth. Humanity did not die quietly. Deep within the command chambers of the Concord's High Council, Grand Strategist Zivar stood before his superiors. The hollow footage played on a massive screen, Voss standing amid the wreckage, victorious. The last human, unbowed. The council chamber was silent. For the first time in the history of the Concord, they had encountered a species that would not submit, that would not surrender, that fought back. An elder counselor finally spoke. His voice unsteady. This was supposed to be an easy war. Zivar turned, his mandibles clicking. There is no such thing as an easy war against humans. The words felt heavy, final. Humanity was no longer an afterthought, a primitive species to be erased. They were something far worse. They were an enemy. Back on the ruined battlefield, Voss activated his distress beacon. Not to call for rescue, but to send a message, a challenge. There were other survivors. He knew it. They had fought alone for too long. Now it was time to fight together. As the beacon pulsed, sending its signal across the stars, he smirked. The war had changed. The Concord thought they had crushed humanity. They had only scattered it. And now humanity was coming back, one battle at a time, one war at a time, until the galaxy remembered why humans were never meant to be underestimated. The message traveled across the void, bouncing between dead satellites, buried comm relays, and forgotten human colonies. A simple signal, a pulse, a call to arms. In the abandoned ruins of Epsilon 9, where the last known human ships had vanished, a deep space receiver flickered to life. A lone survivor, barely clinging to life, stirred at the sound, a frequency he hadn't heard since Earth fell. The beacon was active. Someone was still out there. Hope, something long buried beneath years of war and isolation, flickered back to life. The last embers of humanity were no longer dying, they were reigniting. Inside the Grand Concord chamber, the highest-ranking warlords and strategists convened. Holograms displayed the brutal aftermath of the battle. Their battle. They had outnumbered the humans 1,000 to 1, and they had lost. "We must act now," one of the generals growled. "Deploy our full might before they regroup." "No," Ziva said, his voice measured. "That is exactly what they expect." He played the last frame of the battle footage. Voss, bloodied but smiling, watching their fleet retreat. "He wanted us to see this," Ziva continued. "He wanted us to remember." A pause. The realization spread through the chamber like a cold wind. This was no longer a war of conquest. This was a reckoning, and the humans were coming for them. Voss sat atop the ruins of his latest battlefield, watching the stars. The beacon's signal had been sent, but there was no telling who would hear it. He didn't care. The Concord had burned Earth, wiped out billions, and declared the war won before it had even begun. But wars weren't won by proclamations. They were won by those too stubborn to die. And humans never stopped fighting. Voss leaned back, staring into the endless void of space. Somewhere out there, more of his kind were waiting, hiding, surviving, not for long. Now they would rise. Now the galaxy would remember, and when the last human fired back, the war would never be the same again. To be continued.